"You belong under our roof tonight," the three Apache women declared on the ranch. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the vast stretches of the ranch. Golden light spread across the dry earth, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. The ranch itself was a quiet place, surrounded by rolling hills and scattered patches of desert shrubs. It had always been a peaceful, if somewhat lonely place. The rancher, a man in his 40s named Thomas, had been managing the property alone for years. His family had moved to town years ago, seeking schools, jobs, and a life that the ranch, isolated as it was, could not provide. He had stayed behind because the ranch was more than just land to him. It was a home, a legacy, and a responsibility. Thomas walked along the fence line, inspecting the posts and the worn wires. The wind carried a dry, dusty scent, and the faint sound of a distant coyote filled the quiet. He paused for a moment, looking out over the fields, feeling the solitude press in around him. There was a certain rhythm to life on the ranch, he thought. Every day was full of small tasks, feeding the animals, checking the fences, mending broken tools, but even the smallest tasks gave him a sense of purpose. And yet, there was an emptiness, a quiet longing for connection that he could not quite shake. It was late afternoon when he first noticed them. At the edge of the property, three figures appeared, walking steadily across the dry earth. At first he thought they might be travelers passing by, but as they drew closer he realized they were moving with purpose. They were women, three of them, dressed in simple clothing that spoke of practicality rather than fashion. Their hair was dark, their faces calm but strong, and there was a quiet confidence in the way they walked. They carried small bundles wrapped in cloth, suggesting that they had traveled far and were seeking a place to rest. Thomas felt a mix of curiosity and caution. It was rare for anyone to approach the ranch uninvited. Most people gave the place a wide berth, assuming it was empty or that the man who lived there preferred solitude.
Yet these women did not hesitate or seem afraid.
They kept walking steadily toward him, their eyes calm but alert. As they reached the main gate, one of the women stepped forward. "Brett."
She spoke in a clear, steady voice. "We seek shelter for the night," she said.
"We mean no harm. We only need a place to stay until morning." Thomas studied them carefully.
There was honesty in her voice, but he had learned over the years that appearances could be misleading. He hesitated. He was not used to hosting strangers, and he had spent so long alone that the thought of company was almost overwhelming. But there was something in their demeanor, something unspoken yet undeniable, that made him consider their requests seriously. After a moment of thought, he opened the gate wider and gestured toward the main house. "You can stay here for the night," he said.
"There is food, and there is water. I hope that is enough." The women nodded in gratitude and moved toward the house.
Their movements were careful and deliberate, as if every step was considered. Thomas watched them, noting the way they carried themselves, the way their eyes seemed to take in every detail without judgment. There was a quiet strength about them, a resilience born from experience and necessity. Inside the house, Thomas led them to a room he had prepared for guests, though it had rarely been used in years. The furniture was simple: a few beds, a small table, and chairs worn smooth by time. The women set down their bundles and began to settle in, arranging their belongings with care. There was a sense of order in their actions, a sense that they had done this many times before. Yet there was also respect for the space they were occupying. Thomas excused himself to prepare food. He started a fire in the kitchen stove and gathered ingredients for a simple meal: bread, beans, and some vegetables he had grown himself. The smell of cooking filled the house, mingling with the scent of the evening air that drifted in through open windows. When the meal was ready, he called the women to the table. They ate quietly at first, but as the food warmed them and their hunger was satisfied, conversation began to flow. The women introduced themselves, sharing their names and a little of their journey. They spoke of the lands they had crossed, the towns they had seen, and the challenges of traveling as a small group in a vast, sometimes unforgiving country. Thomas listened, fascinated. Their words painted pictures of places he had never been, experiences he had never imagined, and a perspective on life that was both humbling and inspiring. One of the women spoke of her family, the traditions they upheld, and the lessons passed down through generations. Another described the challenges of living in a world that often misunderstood or overlooked them. The third, quieter than the others, occasionally added a word or gesture that revealed wisdom in the simplest of observations. Thomas found himself drawn to their stories, not as an outsider, but as someone learning to see the world through their eyes. As the night deepened, they moved to the living room. Sitting around the fireplace, the fire crackled and popped, casting warm, flickering shadows on the walls. The women shared stories of resilience, survival, and community. Breaths. They spoke of their culture with pride and yet with humility, emphasizing the importance of respect for the land, for one another, and for oneself.
Thomas felt a shift within him, a stirring of emotions he had long kept buried.
Breath. There was a sense of connection, a reminder that life was not meant to be lived in isolation, no matter how necessary solitude might sometimes be. The women did not demand attention or gratitude. They simply shared their presence, their knowledge, and their humanity. And in that sharing, Thomas felt something he had not felt in years: the quiet joy of companionship, the warmth of mutual respect, and the beginning of a trust that was both fragile and profound. Before long, it was late. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the women prepared for the night. Thomas offered them blankets and pillows, which they accepted with gratitude. They spoke briefly of the morning, but there was no rush. The quiet of the ranch settled around them, and Thomas felt the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. Round, as he prepared to retire to his own room, he glanced back at the women. They were already resting, their breathing steady, their faces calm. There was a sense of peace in their presence, a feeling that, despite the unpredictability of life, some encounters were meant to happen. Thomas realized that this night, which had begun as a simple act of hospitality, might be the start of something far greater. A chance to learn, to grow, and perhaps to change in ways he had never imagined. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees and across the open fields. The ranch, quiet and still under the blanket of night, seemed different somehow. Not lonely, not empty, but alive with possibility, perhaps. And in the warmth of the house, Thomas sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the unexpected arrival of three women who had, without intention, begun to shift the course of his life. He knew that the night was only the beginning.
There were lessons to be learned, stories to be shared, and bonds to be formed.
And while he did not yet understand the full measure of what was to come, he felt ready to face it, guided by the quiet strength and wisdom of the women who had stepped into his life with nothing more than a request for shelter and a willingness to share who they were. The fire continued to glow softly, the shadows danced, and the ranch, which had once been a place of quiet routine, now held the promise of transformation. Thomas understood, in a way he could not fully articulate, that some nights were not just nights. They were beginnings. And this night, he knew, was exactly that.
Morning came quietly over the ranch.
The first light of day slipped through the gaps in the wooden shutters, painting soft lines of gold in rows across the floor. Thomas woke early, as was his habit, moving quietly so as not to disturb the women. The house smelled faintly of last night's fire and the fresh morning air that drifted in from the open windows. He looked around at the three women, still asleep, and felt a strange sense of calm. There was something reassuring about their presence. Even in their silence, they had brought warmth and life into a house that had felt too empty for years. After washing his face and taking a moment to enjoy the cool morning breeze, Thomas went outside to tend to the animals. The horses were grazing calmly, and the chickens were pecking at the dry earth, clucking softly. Pass. As he moved about, he thought about last night's conversation and how unusual it had been to share stories with strangers in such a deep and meaningful way. There was a feeling of connection, a sense that these women were not simply passing through, they were intentional in their visit, though he did not yet understand why. By the time he returned to the house, the women were awake. They were already busy preparing a simple breakfast, boiling water for tea, arranging bread and fruit on the small table. Their movements were deliberate, careful, and calm, each action done with an awareness of their surroundings. Thomas joined them, and for a moment they worked in quiet harmony, each respecting the other's space. Once breakfast was ready, they all sat together. The women shared pieces of their journey, telling Thomas about the landscapes they had crossed, the rivers they had followed, and the hills they had climbed. One spoke of nights spent under the stars, where the sky seemed endless, and the wind carried stories from far-off places, breaths. Another described the lessons they had learned from their elders, how to read the signs of the land, how to find water in dry places, and how to travel safely, even when alone. The third woman added small observations, noting the details of the ranch and asking thoughtful questions about the animals, the crops, and the routines Thomas followed each day. Thomas listened intently, fascinated by the depth of knowledge the women shared. It was unlike anything he had encountered before. Their experiences were practical, yet filled with wisdom that went beyond simple survival. They spoke of respect for the land and for each other, of patience and understanding, and of the strength that comes from community. He realized that their presence was not accidental. They had a purpose, though what it was remained unclear. After breakfast, the women suggested a walk around the ranch. Thomas agreed, curious about what they might notice. As they moved through the fields, the women observed the plants, the soil, and the condition of the fences. They asked questions about his routines and offered subtle suggestions, not as criticism, but as gentle guidance. One pointed out a weak spot in the fence, explaining that it might allow smaller animals to escape. Another showed him a better way to store water for the animals during the hotter months. Their insights were practical, but delivered in a way that was thoughtful and kind. Thomas began to see them differently. They were not merely visitors. They were teachers in their own right, showing him perspectives he had never considered. Their approach was never forceful. They did not insist he change anything immediately. Instead, they allowed him to see the wisdom in their observations and decide for himself. It was a patient, respectful way of teaching, and Thomas found himself absorbing every detail. As they walked, the conversation naturally turned towards stories of the past. The women shared memories of their childhoods, of lessons learned from parents and elders, and of experiences that had shaped their lives. One spoke of the value of kindness, even in situations where it seemed unnecessary. Another emphasized the importance of courage, not the kind that comes from bravado, but the quiet courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. The third shared reflections on patience, teaching Thomas that some things, like growth, healing, and understanding, could not be rushed. Thomas felt a shift within himself as he listened. For years, he had focused only on the tangible aspects of ranch life, the animals, the fences, the crops. But now he began to consider the intangible elements, the patience required to care for life, the respect needed to work with nature, and the importance of nurturing relationships with others. It was a lesson in balance, one he had never known he needed. By midday, they returned to the house, and the women suggested helping with the chores. Thomas hesitated at first. He was used to managing the ranch alone. But as he watched them, he realized that their help was not just physical. It was a way of teaching him through action.
They worked together, feeding the animals, repairing a section of fence, and tidying the barn.
Each task became a lesson, demonstrating not only skill but also care, attentiveness, and cooperation. Thomas began to see the potential of shared labor, not just as a necessity, but as a way to build connection and understanding. During the afternoon, One of the women led Thomas to a small area of the ranch that had been neglected. The soil was dry and compacted, and weeds had overtaken much of the space. She showed him how to loosen the earth, plant seeds carefully, and nurture the soil for future growth. It was a simple act, but Thomas felt a sense of renewal as he worked alongside her.
For the first time in years, he felt that the land was not just his responsibility, but a shared endeavor, something that could thrive with care, attention, and the right guidance.
As the sun began to dip low in the sky, the women suggested gathering near the fire once more.
They built a small, controlled fire outside where they could sit and share stories in the warmth of the fading day. Here, their conversations became deeper, moving beyond practical lessons to reflections on life, resilience, and identity. They spoke of challenges they had faced, the ways they had adapted, and the importance of holding on to values even when the world seemed to push against them. Thomas listened, captivated not only by their words but by the calm authority in which they spoke. He began to see patterns in their stories, lessons woven subtly into narratives, lessons about respect, patience, courage, and compassion.
The women were not lecturing, they were offering insights through the lens of their own experiences.
Thomas found himself reflecting on his own life, considering decisions he had made, habits he had maintained, and opportunities he had missed. Their presence encouraged him to look inward, to examine his own routines and choices, and to think about the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. As night fell, the sky turned deep blue, and stars began to appear one by one. The women remained by the fire, their faces glowing in the soft light. They spoke quietly of the importance of observing, listening, and understanding the world around them. One of them mentioned the way the stars had guided her ancestors, teaching patience and direction. Another spoke of the wind, how it could carry messages if one paid close attention. And the third reminded Thomas that life itself was a series of lessons, some obvious, some subtle, all valuable if one remained open to learning. Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. These women had arrived as strangers, asking only for shelter, yet they had given him far more than he could have imagined. Perspective, wisdom, and the beginning of a deeper understanding of himself and the land he cared for. Their visit had already transformed his routine, turning ordinary tasks into meaningful lessons, and he knew that the experience would continue to influence him in ways he could not yet see. Before retiring for the night, they discussed plans for the next day. They would continue exploring the ranch, observing its rhythms and offering guidance wherever they could. Thomas looked forward to it, curious about what he might learn next, and eager to continue this unexpected journey. The night had begun as a simple act of hospitality, but it had blossomed into something far more significant, a connection between people, a sharing of wisdom, and a beginning of transformation that neither he nor the women could have predicted. As they settled down to sleep, Thomas gazed out the window at the darkened fields. The ranch, once just a place of routine labor and quiet isolation, now felt alive with possibility. The presence of the three women had brought not just companionship, but insight, reflection, and a sense of hope. Thomas understood that life had a way of sending lessons in unexpected forms, and he felt fortunate to be open to receiving them. The wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the promise of a new day. Thomas knew that he was beginning a chapter of his life unlike any he had experienced before, one shaped by guidance, friendship, and wisdom shared by three travelers who had arrived at just the right moment. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a quiet anticipation for the lessons, stories, and moments that tomorrow would bring. The next morning arrived with a soft glow that spread over the ranch, making the earth shimmer as though it were sprinkled with gold dust. Thomas woke to the sound of birds chirping and the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. The house smelled faintly of last night's fire and the fresh morning air. For a moment he paused at the window, looking out over the fields, the animals moving slowly in the dawn. The three women were already awake, moving quietly through the rooms as if they had always lived in the house. Their calmness had a strange effect on him. He felt an inner stillness, as if their presence had settled something he hadn't realized was restless. Breakfast was simple but nourishing, just as it had been the day before. Bread, fruit, and a few eggs Thomas had collected from the chickens. As they ate, the conversation turned naturally to the ranch itself. The women asked questions about the routines, the animals, and the land. They seemed genuinely interested, not just in the tasks, but in the why behind them. Thomas found himself explaining more than he usually did, noticing for the first time how much of his daily work had become habit without much thought. After breakfast, one of the women suggested they walk through the back fields. Thomas agreed, curious to see what they might notice. As they moved through the ranch, the women observed quietly, occasionally pointing out small details he had overlooked. A patch of soil that needed tending, a fence post that was slightly loose, even the way the wind affected the growth of certain plants. Each observation was gentle, never critical, but Thomas felt his awareness sharpening. He began to notice the rhythms of the land in a way he hadn't before, the subtle signs of change, the little patterns that hinted at what the animals or plants might need. While walking, the women began to share lessons without calling them lessons. One spoke of watching the weather, how clouds and wind could tell more than any forecast. But another described the ways animals communicated with each other, how observing them carefully could teach patience and understanding. The third added reflections on the importance of noticing the small details in life, how what seemed ordinary could hold the key to growth, learning, and even happiness. Thomas listened closely, realizing that these lessons were not just about the ranch, but about life itself. Returning to the barn, they began helping with the chores. At first, Thomas had hesitated, used to doing everything alone. But he soon saw that their help was more than physical. It was instructional.
One of the women showed him how to stack hay so it stayed dry longer.
Another demonstrated a better way to handle the animals, using calm movements and soft voices.
The third suggested organizing the tools to make daily work smoother and more efficient.
Every action seemed small, but together they created a rhythm and efficiency Thomas had never experienced. As they worked, the women did not simply tell Thomas what to do. They demonstrated, guided, and let him try. If he made a mistake, they corrected him gently, allowing him to learn without feeling embarrassed or pressured. In these moments, Thomas began to understand something important. The way one approaches work, with attention and care, affects not only the results but the satisfaction and peace one feels while doing it. It was a simple lesson, yet profound in its impact. By mid-morning, the group moved to a small area near the edge of the ranch where wildflowers and shrubs grew sparsely. The women had noticed that the soil was compacted and the plants struggled to grow. One of them knelt and began loosening the earth with a small hand tool, showing Thomas the proper way to aerate the soil without harming the roots. She explained how the plants, like people, needed support, patience, and careful attention to thrive. Another woman helped him plant new seeds, explaining the timing, depth, and spacing that would give them the best chance to grow. Thomas was fascinated. These actions, so simple yet thoughtful, were teaching him lessons he hadn't expected. The value of patience, the rewards of careful observation, and the importance of nurturing life with intention. As they worked, conversation continued. The women shared stories of their ancestors, people who had lived closely with the land, learning from every season, every animal, every stone. They spoke of how understanding the natural world required humility, attention, and respect. Thomas realized that their lessons were not only practical, but philosophical. Each suggestion, each small demonstration carried wisdom about life, about understanding the world, and about understanding oneself. After tending the small plot of land, they returned to the house for a midday meal. While eating, Thomas found himself reflecting on the morning. The women's presence had changed the way he saw the ranch, the animals, and even his own daily tasks. There was a quiet joy in being attentive, in noticing small details, and in approaching life with intention. He realized that much of his previous routine had been done on autopilot, with little thought beyond necessity. Now, with the women guiding and observing, even ordinary tasks became meaningful, even transformative. In the afternoon, one of the women suggested observing the animals more closely. They walked among the horses, chickens, and cattle, noting behaviors, movements, and patterns. She explained that the animals, like people, communicate in subtle ways, and learning to understand them required patience and attentiveness. Thomas followed her lead, watching the horses' ears, the subtle shifts in posture, and the small gestures that revealed their feelings. For the first time, he felt a deep connection to the creatures he had cared for years, as if he were seeing them not as property or routine work, but as living beings with needs, emotions, and personalities. By late afternoon, Thomas began to understand the deeper purpose of the women's presence. They were not there merely to help with chores or provide companionship. They were showing him a way to see the world differently, to notice, to respect, to care, and to learn from every small interaction. Their guidance was subtle, unassuming, yet powerful. It was the kind of teaching that could not be rushed or forced. It required openness, attentiveness, and reflection. Thomas felt fortunate to be receiving such lessons, recognizing that they were rare and valuable. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the women suggested a small activity before evening. They wanted to show Thomas how to observe natural signs that could indicate changes in the weather or the needs of the land. Brask. They walked to a small hill overlooking the ranch, the wind brushing against their faces. One of the women pointed to the clouds, explaining how their formation could signal rain or wind. Another showed him patterns in the soil and the plants that indicated moisture levels and fertility. The third explained how observing these signs carefully could prevent problems before they arose. Thomas was amazed at the detail and precision of their knowledge. It was practical, yes, but it also carried a deeper lesson. That attentiveness and care in everyday life could lead to wisdom, understanding, and preparedness. Evening arrived quietly. The women suggested building a small fire outside, where they could sit and reflect on the day. As the flames danced and the shadows shifted across the ground, conversation turned inward. They spoke about the importance of self-reflection, of noticing one's own habits, thoughts, and patterns. They encouraged Thomas to think about not only the land and the animals, but himself, his routines, his choices, and the ways he approached life. They asked thoughtful questions, not to judge, but to prompt insight and awareness. Thomas found himself opening up, considering thoughts he had long ignored, and feeling a sense of clarity he had never known before. One woman spoke about patience, explaining that growth, whether of plants, animals, or people, cannot be rushed. Another discussed courage, not the loud kind, but quiet courage, the strength to face challenges, to learn, and to adapt. The third reminded Thomas of respect for the land, for life, and for oneself. Each lesson was subtle, yet Thomas could feel its impact sinking into his mind and heart like water into dry soil. As night fell, Thomas stood quietly, watching the stars appear one by one. Branch, once a place of routine work and solitude, now felt alive with meaning and purpose. The women had transformed the day, not through grand gestures, but through the careful, deliberate sharing of their presence, knowledge, and insight. Thomas understood that these unspoken lessons, the ones taught through observation, guidance, and example, were perhaps the most powerful of all. Before retiring for the night, they discussed the next day. There would be more work, more observation, and more opportunities for learning. Thomas felt eager, not just for tasks to be completed, but for the chance to grow, to notice, and to reflect. He realized that life on the ranch could be more than mere survival or routine. It could be a journey of understanding, attentiveness, and meaningful connection. As they settled down to sleep, Thomas looked out over the fields once more. The wind carried a gentle hush across the land. The animals rested peacefully, and the firelight from the house glowed softly. The women had come as travelers seeking shelter, yet they had given him far more than he had expected. They had brought insight, guidance, and a sense of connection that he would carry with him long after their visit ended. For Thomas, this day was a turning point. He had learned that lessons could come in quiet ways, that growth required patience, and that understanding the world and oneself depended on attentiveness, respect, and openness. He knew that tomorrow would bring more experiences, more opportunities to learn, and more chances to see the world through the eyes of these remarkable women. And as he closed his eyes, he felt a sense of anticipation, gratitude, and quiet excitement for what the next day would hold. The morning sun rose over the ranch with a soft warmth, painting the hills and fields in golden light. The animals were already awake, moving slowly through the crisp air, while Thomas prepared for the day's work. The three women had risen early as usual, moving quietly through the house and preparing breakfast. There was a rhythm to their movements, a calm certainty that seemed to settle over the entire ranch. Thomas watched them for a moment, feeling a growing sense of trust and admiration. Their presence was no longer just a curiosity. It was becoming a part of his life, a quiet guidance that helped him see the world more clearly. After breakfast, the women suggested they take a walk to check on the horses in the far paddock. Thomas agreed, feeling that this was more than a routine task. It was an opportunity to observe, to learn, and perhaps to practice the lessons they had been sharing over the past few days. The path to the paddock wound through uneven terrain with loose stones and patches of thick grass. As they walked, the women noticed small details that Thomas had overlooked. A horse had a slight scrape on its leg. Another was slightly thinner than usual, and one of the fence posts was beginning to lean. Each observation was made calmly, without alarm, and each was accompanied by careful advice on how to address it. Thomas followed their lead, learning to observe closely, to notice subtle signs of change, and to act with care. As he worked with them to tend to the horses, he realized that the women's guidance was not only practical but also deeply instructive. They were teaching him patience, attentiveness, and the importance of acting with intention.
It was a lesson he had never received in books or from anyone before.
By late morning, a sudden commotion broke the calm of the ranch. One of the horses, startled by a bird, or perhaps a sudden noise, had broken free from the paddock. It ran across the open fields, panicking and kicking at anything in its path. Thomas felt a surge of panic. If the horse got too far, it could injure itself or others.
His heart raced as he tried to think quickly about how to handle the situation.
The women, however, remained calm. One of them stepped forward and spoke quietly, her voice steady, giving Thomas clear instructions on how to approach the animal without frightening it further. Together they moved carefully toward the horse. The first woman led with gentle gestures, showing Thomas how to use calm body language to reassure the animal. The second positioned herself to block the horse from running into danger, and the third offered support, ready to act if the situation changed. Thomas followed their lead, mimicking their movements and listening to their guidance. The horse, though still nervous, began to slow as the women approached, their patience and understanding making all the difference. After several tense minutes, they managed to guide the horse back into the paddock safely. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and awe. He had been ready to act hastily, but the women had shown him the power of calmness, patience, and clear observation. Their guidance had not only saved the horse from harm, but had also taught him an invaluable lesson about handling crisis with composure. The incident left Thomas reflecting on the lessons of the morning. The women had shown him that courage is not about rushing in or reacting with force, but about staying calm, assessing the situation, and acting with wisdom. He realized that he had approached many problems in life too hastily, without taking the time to observe or think carefully. The experience was a turning point, one that would stay with him for years to come. After the tension had passed, they returned to the house for lunch. The women suggested sitting outside under the shade of a large tree, where the breeze offered a welcome relief from the growing heat of the day.
As they ate, the conversation turned to stories of resilience.
The women spoke of challenges they had faced in their own lives and the ways they had overcome them, not through force or stubbornness, but through observation, patience, and careful planning. Each story carried a subtle lesson, and Thomas found himself reflecting on how those lessons could apply to his own life and work on the ranch. In the afternoon, the women suggested they work on a new project together. There was a small, neglected garden near the barn that had long been overlooked. The soil was dry and uneven, and weeds had taken over much of the space. They wanted to transform it into a productive area, not just for vegetables, but as a way to demonstrate how attention, care, and cooperation could create something meaningful. Thomas agreed, eager to continue learning from them. The three women guided him through each step of the process. They showed him how to prepare the soil, plant seeds with care, and create a system for watering and nurturing the plants. They emphasized the importance of observation, explaining that the garden would thrive not simply by planting seeds, but by noticing the small changes each day, the growth of seedlings, the health of the soil, and the signs of insects or disease. Thomas realized that this was another lesson in life. Success and growth require constant attention, patience, and a willingness to learn from what the world presents. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, a sudden thunderstorm approached. The clouds gathered quickly, dark and heavy, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Thomas felt a familiar sense of worry. If the storm intensified, it could damage the crops, flood low areas, and create more work than he could handle alone. But the women, as always, remained calm. They quickly guided him to secure the garden, protect the animals, and cover vulnerable areas of the ranch. Each action was deliberate, organized, and effective. The storm passed with minimal damage, and Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for the women's knowledge and composure. He realized that he had been alone for too long, relying only on himself, when the guidance and support of others could make a profound difference. The experience reinforced the lessons he had been learning over the past days. Calmness, observation, patience, and cooperation are more powerful than fear, haste, or isolation.
As the rain cleared and the sun returned, they gathered near the fire once more.
The women shared stories about the land and its rhythms, explaining how people in their community had lived with nature for generations. They spoke of observing the weather, the seasons, and the behavior of animals, and how these observations could guide decisions in everyday life. Thomas listened carefully, realizing that these teachings extended far beyond ranch work. They were lessons in living with awareness, respect, and intentionality. The day continued into evening, and the women suggested a quiet reflection before bed. They encouraged Thomas to think about the day, the lessons he had observed, and the choices he had made during the storm. He realized that this reflection was as important as any physical task. They were teaching him not just to act, but to consider, to observe, and to internalize experience. By nightfall, Thomas felt a sense of accomplishment and clarity he had never known. The ranch, which had seemed vast and sometimes overwhelming, now felt manageable and full of possibilities. He understood that the women's presence had transformed not only his routines but his perspective. They had shown him how to approach challenges with calmness and wisdom, how to observe closely and act thoughtfully, and how to build connection and cooperation into every task. As they prepared for sleep, Thomas watched the women move about with ease and confidence. Their presence had become a stabilizing force in his life, guiding him gently yet profoundly. He realized that their visit was not merely temporary. It was a turning point, a chance for him to learn, grow, and perhaps change the way he lived entirely. The night settled over the ranch, and Thomas felt a quiet gratitude for the lessons, the guidance, and the calm strength of the women who had entered his life so unexpectedly. He understood now that true courage is quiet, patience is powerful, and wisdom often comes from observing rather than rushing. And in the glow of the firelight, with the storm behind them and the promise of another day ahead, Thomas felt ready for whatever challenges might come, guided by the presence and lessons of the three remarkable women who had shown him a new way of seeing and living. Morning came softly over the ranch, with light spreading across the fields and the hills beyond. The air was cool and calm, carrying the faint scent of earth, grass, and the distant aroma of cooking fires from neighboring homes. Thomas awoke early, as was his habit. But this morning felt different. The presence of the three women had changed the rhythm of his life, their guidance and patience now deeply rooted in his mind and heart. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb them, though he knew they were already awake, moving about the house in their usual calm, purposeful way. After a simple breakfast of bread, fruit, and eggs, they gathered to discuss the day ahead. The women had decided that it was time for Thomas to practice what he had learned over the past days, applying the lessons of observation, patience, and thoughtful action on his own, while they provided guidance as needed. Preparation. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, not tense or anxious, but full of quiet purpose. Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and a hint of nervousness. He knew this day would mark the culmination of all that he had been learning. They began by checking the fences and animals throughout the ranch, just as they had done together before. Thomas moved with more confidence now, noticing the subtle shifts in the soil, the animals' behaviors, and the plants' conditions. He recognized the small signs that indicated whether a fence needed repair, a plant needed water, or a horse required attention. The women observed him closely but spoke sparingly, offering gentle encouragement rather than instruction.
It was clear that today, Thomas would take the lead, putting the lessons into practice himself.
As the morning progressed, Thomas found that he was able to handle tasks with a level of calm and precision he had never experienced before. When a fence post needed replacing, he approached it thoughtfully, considering the angle, the firmness of the soil, and the best way to secure it. When feeding the animals, he observed their behaviors first, noticing subtle cues that indicated hunger or discomfort. With each action, he felt a growing confidence, not from force or haste, but from careful attention, respect, and patience. By mid-morning, the women suggested moving to the small garden they had begun cultivating together. Thomas surveyed the area, noting the growth of the plants, the condition of the soil, and the small weeds that had begun to emerge. He worked methodically, loosening the soil where needed, removing unwanted plants, and arranging the seedlings carefully. As he worked, he felt a sense of connection to the land and to the process of growth. Every small action carried meaning, a reflection of the lessons the women had been imparting over the past days. During this time, the women shared stories that seemed simple at first, but were filled with wisdom. One spoke of the seasons, and how each change brought opportunities to learn patience and adaptability. Another told a story about observing the smallest animals, and how attention to detail could reveal lessons about cooperation and resilience. The third shared reflections on kindness, emphasizing that true strength comes from understanding, empathy, and respect for all living things. Thomas absorbed these lessons quietly, feeling them sink into his mind and heart as he worked. As the afternoon approached, Thomas faced a small challenge. One of the animals had wandered too close to the edge of the property, and there was a risk it could slip into a neighboring field. This situation required both careful planning and calm execution. Thomas approached it methodically, recalling the guidance the women had given during the horse incident a few days before.
He moved slowly, observing the animal's behavior, using gentle gestures and soft words to guide it back safely.
The women watched, offering encouragement but allowing him to take the lead entirely. When the task was completed successfully, Thomas felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was not simply that he had solved the problem, but that he had done so with patience, awareness, and care, qualities he had only begun to develop under their guidance. After this success, the women suggested taking a short break. They sat together under the shade of a large tree, sharing water and fruit.
The conversation turned reflective, focusing on the past days and what Thomas had learned.
They reminded him that growth, understanding, and wisdom come gradually, often through observation and careful action rather than immediate results. They spoke of resilience, courage, and respect, not as abstract concepts but as principles to live by in everyday life. Thomas listened intently, realizing how deeply their guidance had already shaped his perspective. In the late afternoon, the women suggested a final activity before their departure. They wanted Thomas to walk the ranch alone, observing its rhythms and applying everything he had learned. This would be his opportunity to integrate their teachings fully and to see the land, the animals, and himself in a new light. Thomas agreed, feeling both anticipation and a quiet reverence for the moment. As he walked through the fields, he noticed every detail: the sway of the grass and the wind, the subtle signs of animals' moods, and the patterns in the soil that indicated its health. He adjusted a fence post here, moved a bucket of water there, and ensured that the animals were comfortable and fed. Each action was thoughtful, deliberate, and guided by the principles the women had shared. He realized that the ranch was no longer simply a place of work. It was a living, breathing environment that required respect, attention, and care. When he returned to the house, the women were waiting, their faces calm but full of warmth. They praised his efforts, not with grand words, but with quiet acknowledgement that reflected their approval. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude and understanding. He now saw that their visit had been about far more than simple assistance. They had shown him how to live with awareness, patience, and respect, how to approach challenges calmly, and how to integrate wisdom into daily life. As evening approached, it became clear that their time together was coming to an end. The women had prepared for departure, packing their bundles with the same careful attention they had shown throughout their stay. Thomas helped them with the preparations, feeling a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Their presence had transformed the ranch, his routines, and his perspective on life. Though their visit had begun as a simple act of hospitality, it had become a profound experience of learning, reflection, and growth. Before leaving, the women gathered Thomas and spoke gently, their words carrying the weight of guidance and encouragement. They reminded him to continue observing, reflecting, and applying the lessons he had learned. They emphasized the importance of patience, courage, respect, and care, encouraging him to integrate these principles into every aspect of his life. Thomas listened carefully, realizing that these words would stay with him long after their departure, shaping the way he approached the ranch, the animals, and even himself. Finally, the time came for them to leave. Thomas walked with them to the edge of the property, watching as they moved with quiet confidence and grace. He felt a sense of loss, but also a profound appreciation for the impact they had made on his life. As the women disappeared over the horizon, he understood that their visit had been a turning point, a beginning of a new chapter defined by awareness, respect, and purposeful action. The ranch, once simply a place of routine and solitude, now felt alive with meaning and possibility. Thomas looked over the fields, the animals moving calmly in their enclosures, and felt a deep sense of connection. He knew that the lessons the women had imparted, through words, action, and example, would guide him in the days, months, and years to come. He reflected on the patience, courage, and wisdom they had shared, understanding that true growth comes not from force, but from observation, reflection, and thoughtful action.
As night fell, Thomas sat by the fire one last time, thinking back on the past days.
The experiences, the lessons, and the stories shared had changed him in ways he could not yet fully articulate. He felt a quiet strength, a sense of clarity, and a deeper appreciation for the life he had chosen on the ranch. The women had taught him that life is a series of small, meaningful actions, each carrying lessons that, when observed carefully, can guide one toward wisdom, understanding, and fulfillment. Finally, Thomas stood and looked out across the ranch, feeling a sense of peace and purpose. The wind whispered softly through the trees, carrying the memory of the women's presence and the lessons they had shared. He understood that their visit had been more than a simple encounter. It had been a gift of perspective, guidance, and quiet strength. And though they were gone, the impact of their visit would remain, shaping his actions, thoughts, and understanding for the rest of his life. Brass began to appear one by one. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, reflecting on all that had happened.
He knew that life would continue to present challenges, moments of uncertainty, and tasks that required patience and care.
But he also knew that he now had the tools, the insight, and the awareness to face them thoughtfully, guided by the wisdom imparted by the three remarkable women who had arrived unexpectedly on his ranch. The night settled over the land, calm and quiet, and Thomas felt a profound sense of gratitude. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a living, breathing space full of lessons, meaning, and connection. He understood that true strength comes from observation, patience, and thoughtful action, and that guidance can arrive in the form of quiet presence, gentle instruction, and shared experience. And with that understanding, Thomas felt ready to face the days ahead, carrying with him the lessons, memories, and wisdom of the three women who had, in a single visit, changed his life forever.